Well, good morning, all. My name is Ryan Hennessy. I'm Solutions Architect with Red Hat, based out of the Chicagoland area. I'm here today to talk about modernizing application deployments with OpenShift Container Platform. That's a very fancy title. For what today's talk is going to be about is our customer use case of OpenShift. Come on. Oops. Today's talk will be focused on the customer's use case, the challenges that they had, the issues that they faced throughout the whole deployment process. I was lucky enough to start this whole process with them from early conception all the way to the finish line. So that was an optimal story for me, at least, to share with you guys today. They unfortunately weren't able to come with us today and present today. It was the original plan. So today we're going to be just talking to them in general terminology. We'll have time afterwards. If you have questions, please bring them up, and love to answer them. So the organizational challenges, the non-technical drivers that the customer was facing, ultimately all driven around a huge amount of reduction in workforce. Early on, working with my main contact that was really interested in OpenShift and really interested in deploying it, he was early on my biggest detractor. He and his team had built up this huge amount of process based on, we can deploy Tomcat instances in a matter of days, building on all of our homegrown scripts and this wonderful processes that we've built and we're very proud of. Ultimately, after that initial meeting, a huge amount of layoffs happened and the pain happened. Oh crud, we don't have these guys to support these scripts anymore. We can't, this is not scalable any longer. So lo and behold, Todd came back to me saying, could we talk about that OpenShift thing again? It sounds really, really cool. So early on, just really working with Todd, had the opportunity with Todd to have him understand Docker and containerization first, understand the benefits of that first before we even got into the ideas of the platform and orchestrating their workloads across all the different infrastructure that they had in place. And ultimately, the other biggest challenge that we had was there was this overall movement that we need to go to cloud. No one knew what cloud meant to them. So early on, working with Todd, defining a process, defining a really resilient process that can scale as well as provide fast time to market for his customers. He was then perceived as the cloud guy towards the end of it. Everyone walking down the halls through the customer site, everyone would go, oh, Todd, the cloud guy, and okay. So it actually benefited him in the long run, becoming, effectively the cloud guy and the innovator in his organization. Later conversations, we had the opportunity to work with the managers and above, really understanding their business drivers. First and foremost, the biggest thing for them was they were still in the idea that they need to exit the data center business. This certain organization has data centers all around the world, providing services for all the different factories and such for them. They were no longer wanting to do that. How they were going to do that and and still how are they going to do that is still to be determined. But that is the first and foremost really driver for them. The second driver was really that we're going to get out of this data center business, but our customers shouldn't be aware of that problem. That's our problem, that's our burden to take on. But we really need to be, the end business users, the consumers, the applications team should really not be aware that we're moving all this infrastructure out of our data center walls. And then ultimately too, the reduction in process bloat. It was huge, and I'll show you some of the information later on. But and I'm sure you can relate to this. But processes of provisioning a simple instance, a simple JVM container, took multiple weeks. And everyone kind of laughed and chuckled at it and said, "Well, that's the way it is." And to show the ability to just click a button and provision that same instance in a matter of seconds blew people's minds. And first and foremost, they didn't believe it happened. And then when you did show them it happened, and look, that application is running. Oh, okay. It was just earth-shattering for them. So the idea that that whole OpenShift methodology mapped really well to this mission statement was really attractive. And then finally, kind of the same main thought process is really no disruption to the business. instances, once they are deployed, should be able to be moved from one instance or one environment, one farm, one data center to the next, and ultimately the business should have no understanding of that, or nor should they be affected. So all of this, on top of the current state, were the biggest challenges. The current state was fairly crazy. They were very happy to say that they were 100% virtualized. What that meant, though, was they would stand up a virtual machine, very static-like, and deploy as many different Tomcat instances as they could cram into that virtual machine. So that automated process that most of you are probably familiar with, this quick time to market of provisioning a virtual machine, was not the biggest bottleneck. It was, we've got the infrastructure, and then Todd's team was handed this infrastructure and was left to pull as many things as they could, cram as many different instances in there as they possibly can to get the full benefit of what they perceived as the infrastructure. Tomcats, as mentioned, there were multiple machines. The homegrown scripts, this is where that kind of came into play. Todd and his team were very excited, like I said early on, to tout that they had these homegrown scripts. These scripts over time were just kind of developed, and there's that whole idea of that technical debt. Joe Blow built this thing many months ago, and no one knows how it works, but it just works. Heard that time and time again, and really all of this kind of built into the whole the issue of this customization, all this post work, and all this hand holding that had to happen to ultimately get this infrastructure up in place for them. So, all said and done, this is somewhat of a joke, but it is kind of true. When we finished the initial set of requirements, walking through their workflow and walking through all of the different toll gates and everything else that had to need to be done to provision, again, a single JVM instance, this is somewhat what it would look like. It was overwhelming, not only for the Red Hat folks in the room, but I think also for the customers as well. The team there was like, oh, that's really how that works? They were kind of floored at their own processes. So we worked with them. We did a lot of different things, both technically as well as procedural-wise. But ultimately, what they say is, when you first ask this customer, what changed in your environment, they'll say, OpenShift, ta-da! But as we all are aware, technology is an enabler. It is not an overall solution. So with this deployment, yes, OpenShift is a huge part of it, but as you'll see here in a second, a lot of their own processes had to be changed in order for this to be a really successful deployment for them. So the reality, all the teams needed to get on board. That was a challenge. I'm not going to lie. It was a lot of hand-holding. It was a lot of talks. It was a lot of discussions. It was a lot of actually just proving out over time and time again, yeah, this actually does work. It does. We can say what it does, and we can actually demonstrate it to you. And then, yes, that demonstration is not just smoke and mirrors. It actually does work. And you can play with it, you can see it, and it does work. The processes and procedures need to change. We'll talk about this in a little more depth. These same processes, you cannot just stay in place. You can't deploy OpenShift and then wrap your own existing processes around it. It won't work. Well, technically it will work, but it won't be beneficial to you. And then really the stated direction the leadership made. Things had to be, things were hosted and how they run it internally all had to be determined, and who owned what function, who owned that function. All those walls that they really had built up over time had to be broken down. And that's not something that's done overnight. So all those came into place. So mapping to the business needs, those early on discussions with the managers and above, to get out of data center business. OpenShift early on was perceived as just a deployment utility. Let's get rid of all these development scripts, these home-dome scripts, and use this tooling. What they ultimately got out of it was an abstraction of their hardware, an abstraction of their data center in essence. I have a set of processes. Those same processes work whether they're running our data center, when they're running a colo. They were heavy looking into Azure, deploying, and basically when you could deploy RHEL, we could deploy OpenShift for them, and they had the same processes. So right out of basically deploying this, understanding the process, defining their processes around OpenShift, they've basically were able to then say, we can ultimately get out of the data center business. Now, this didn't solve all their problems, it didn't solve all application deployments and such, but it solved a huge chunk of them. And they were able to then show the benefit of, look guys, we can move from here, we can move to here, and really it became the driver for a lot of our other parts of the organization to say, yes, we can do this as well. Customers should happily be oblivious. So one thing that was different for this particular customer was, the idea of OpenShift really early on for a lot of people is, look, we can provide a self-provisioning portal. Todd was adamant right away, I don't want to give that to my developers. I don't trust them. I'm like, okay. So he ultimately and his team, effectively the middleware team, were the owners of the application as well as the consumers. And so by doing so, they really did abstract OpenShift away from all their consumers. They were happily oblivious or unaware of it. What they then did is take all of their new processes, all the ideas of this, CIDC pipeline, all of the other new kind of newfangled functionalities that they were really trying to adopt, plug OpenShift into that workflow, and have the benefits of this, fast, easily deployable application for infrastructure, and innovate on the processes. And ultimately, the consumer just was excited that I have a new process to deploy my app, and it gets done in a matter of minutes. And ultimately, that was the happiest point for them, was that they were able to do that. Ultimately, they're going to get to that model of self-provisioning, but for now, it just was an enabler for a new process. And by doing so, again, it just made it really, really quick and easy for the application user, making them happily oblivious, solving yet another one of those initial drivers of management. The application has to be faster. I can't stress this enough. I think it was 5 weeks to deploy an app. Multiple teams touching this, people's approvals to basically say, yes, we can add more infrastructure to this already existing VM. Okay. So through all those processes that are in the head, pissed some people off, enabled other folks. It wasn't a great time, I'm not going to lie. But working with Todd and working with his team and the Red Hat team, really just, again, reiterating this stuff does work, guys, and it's okay. We got to the point where the process itself fell away, and they were able to deploy applications quicker, faster, and better. The applications, it says the upgrades and such ultimately went from weeks, days to minutes. And that was ultimately Todd's biggest pain point. These homegrown scripts were able to deploy applications really, really pretty easily and quickly. It was that upgrade process. It was that management after the fact that just killed him and killed his team. That was now shrunk down to about 3 people, I think. So having the platform take a lot of that burden on for him, and really just him being the consumer of that, was ultimately his biggest, win for him and his team. And then the final one, no disruption to the business. Sorry, guys. The complexity was removed. The complexity is different. There's a lot of complexity and new challenges for Todd and the infrastructure team to understand. But ultimately, to the end consumer, to developers, and to the business folks, that whole complexity of this convoluted process, I have to talk to Joe Blow, who then doesn't talk to the next guy, so I have to basically walk this piece of paper over to them, was all removed because they adopted a new process, and again, OpenShift was just a part of that whole process. So teams were able to really just say, I need resources, and if the resources were readily available, they were able to deploy their application and have the whole workflow go through and deploy it. The other really beneficial thing for them is, again, that ongoing disruption, and actually removing the ongoing disruption, but also enabling the applications teams and getting a lot of the infrastructure folks out of the way. Was OpenShift ultimately, when they did start giving a little access to the end developers, they had this mechanism of OpenShift to show, here's your log data, here's your application for your statistics to metrics and stuff. Don't log into the box. You don't need to log in the box anymore. So not only am I not providing or removing the disruption, I'm removing complexity from the environment as well for them. And so system audits and security teams and all the folks that ultimately were somewhat of our distractors ultimately found like, this is great. I don't have to manage these application teams anymore and provide application IDs and making sure they're logging in, logging out in the right way, and they're not touching production environments and taking them down. It made it simple and made it a a mechanism so that they could safely log in, get data, and basically remove and get out. So this is all talking about the application teams and talking about Todd and talking about the team, the application customers, this particular customer. What does it mean to you? Couple takeaways for myself, and I'm keeping these high-level bullets, is there's certain things like this. We need to start removing, well, that's how we always done whatever. I hate that statement, and that was the biggest one that was thrown in our face a lot with this deployment was, this is how we've always done it. Okay, why? And it's asking that question. Ultimately, we started creating effectively the swear jar for the type of deployments. If anyone said that, you throw the dollar in. It made it simple to actually start breaking down those walls and having a conversation above and beyond, this is how we've always done it. This one I can't stress enough. If you're looking and really thinking about deploying OpenShift, have a strong understanding of containerization. If you look through, or if you've sat through other OpenShift deployments or other OpenShift demos and such, you'll see the idea that we're trying to really abstract a lot of the container, a lot of the orchestration away from the end user, which is great. But if they have at least a basic understanding what containerization provides them and how they use containers, it makes it so much easier for them to consume. In the case with Todd, he came with a very strong understanding of Docker early on. So early conversations, when we did have them, it was easy to kind of transpose that concept of Docker into what OpenShift was, both for him and his team, as well as when we started really talking to the application folks as well. I stole this from Jim. I just love this when he threw this up on the slides that planning's dead. I would love to go into certain manager types who would say planning is dead and watch their head blow up. Planning is dead. In the essence, all this, I said this, all this process, this bloat, just try it. Just start deploying apps on this. And when they started doing that, they started seeing the wins right away. It was a slow getting to that point, but once they started seeing that I can deploy this app and it worked, oh, okay. I had to tweak things here and there and to get it to work in this platform, but it worked. Okay, let's try the next one. And the overall excitement just kind of built upon itself, and they built more and more apps and deployed more and more apps on the platform, and ultimately the adoption rate just went through the roof. And the process, the procedures for the end user had to change and tweak a little bit, but for Todd and his team, when he was managing the platform, they were happy. It was like, here's the consumer, okay, let's plug you in. You're good, you're done, and then they moved on to the next. So they were removed from that whole idea of, okay, we have this script, well, that broke, okay, now we have to tweak our script to get for that particular use case. No, you're fitting and conforming to this methodology, and we're moving forward. Another one, can't stress this enough, create an open feedback loop, both from your own team members, your team members to the Red Hat team that's working with you, but also just back to the consumers that are of OpenShift. Providing any updates, any feedback. I can't stress it enough too that the content that came from the end consumers for consuming OpenShift in this particular customer, it helped both Todd and his team, but also the Red Hat team understand how OpenShift was working for them and how ultimately that could help maybe other customers as well. I learned a ton from how this worked in this particular customer's case. So yeah, the open feedback really was honestly the best thing. So what all this done, that ta-da moment really does happen. If in fact you can get all these processes and procedures wrapped around it, get your consumers on board with how this works, and ultimately get to the point where it is a platform of choice, whether in the case for this particular customer, Todd, where he was the consumer and the user and the manager, or if you're going to the whole route of self-provisioning. It works if in fact you can get all your ducks in the row. So that is it. I went at a kind of quick pace only because I wanted to leave time for questions and answers if you have any, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot. Yeah, I'm sorry. So how did we approach the breaking down those walls? It was things like the swear jar, for removing that question of, this is how we've always done that. Okay, put the money in the dollar, the dollar in the jar. Okay, now let's really have a legitimate conversation. talks with security early on, I said, were a big pain point. They were the biggest detractors of this because they couldn't understand how all this stuff worked. So, oh no, we can't do this. This is scary. Once you explained it to them and they understood the whole process, it was a lot more easy for them to at least comprehend and say we could do this. So to really answer your question, it was repeating ourselves over and over again. Unfortunately, to the different audiences over and over again and having the same reaction. No. Oh wait, that is kind of cool, and it ultimately won us over. So it does, and early on, no, and the perception does. So I'll repeat the question. Basically, the idea is, the question is, how does this perception of the OpenShift take into account for all these people who say, I want to hold on to my little knowledge base. I'm the guy that does this. It breaks a lot of barriers and it pisses a lot of people off. I'm not going to lie, and people come in, start early on saying, well, no, this is my cheese, don't move it, and it's, especially with the sysadmin guys early on, they actually were kind of the laggers in this whole conversation, which was kind of funny. Todd was smart enough to early on to say, I just need these virtual machines. And they're like, oh, cool, I can stand up RHEL for you. And they were happy as clam to give them RHEL. And he got it up and running. And then once it was up and running, then we could go back to them and start saying, look, guys, this is how it works. Either you get on board or you're kind of left behind. And if you get on board, you can do things like understand containers, and that'll be beneficial for you down the road in this organization and the next, understanding how that works above and beyond that, understanding the nuances of the overlay networking, all of the things that OpenShift provides. That's where you need to understand now. Your understanding of the operating system, great, that's cool. That's ultimately not going away just yet, because for them, the early adoption of OpenShift was really just for this Tomcat environment. It's going to grow over time, but still they have to have kind of a foot in both camps, both understanding OpenShift, but still kind of doing their legacy job as well. And for us, at least in this organization, in this use case, again, the unfortunate part was they were so short-staffed because of layoffs and stuff that it helped, at least early on, get this kind of through because there was less people to put up the roadblocks and such. And then once it was in place, it was kind of like, well, we got to keep going, and just move it forward. So I can't give you the silver bullet, unfortunately, to the answer, and I was expecting that question, so thank you. But yeah, it kind of boils down to personalities and personas, unfortunately. They still understand and still have to have a strong understanding of the operating system. They still have to, and potentially will have to, understand all of the capacity that the cluster has. So they're still managing the infrastructure components of it. One thing we still haven't done in this particular customer, and another one of mine I'm working with now, is deploy CloudForms to understand what's the environment looks like and how they're really growing and how the capacity is being utilized well. So the sysadmin role still kind of sits in that same little wheelhouse where they understand the infrastructure, they understand the capacity of the infrastructure, and Todd, who's our, like I said early on, the proponent of all this, is really just working with the application teams and helping them adopt this technology so they can get faster to market. No, so the sysadmin still has the role of basically the root. He's the, in this organization and another, they are still the root user. It's still that kind of the operations role that's still there, and the whole DevOps functionality. They are still really heavily a part of the overall day-to-day operations, making sure the virtual infrastructure is up, making sure that the OS is patched. It still holds true. They still have to manage all of the data going out of the system. They still manage access to said system. They're still managing log data. So it's all still readily available, and it's still a function that's still needed in an organization. At least for this organization, it's right early on. This is not true PaaS. This is not self-provisioning for them. This is more of an orchestration platform to get faster to market for and replace these homegrown scripts. So that's where the platform was really specific, and that was really a win for this particular organization. Was early, pre-OpenShift, they had to create all these application accounts. They had to manage them. They had unusual security practices around basically how those users were managed and how they were able to log in, what privileges they were able to see. With OpenShift, because everything ran in this container now and OpenShift platform, once Todd was able to relinquish some level of control, the application team logged into the OpenShift console, had a specific role in that console, and was able to see the log data and do basically nothing else. They couldn't spin up, they couldn't drop the number of pods, they couldn't increase them, they couldn't do any config changes, particularly in the upper level environments, but they could see the log data, and that was extreme. Right, so now the security vulnerability, or the security roles fell into OpenShift, removed it from the actual OS. So the sysadmin team, back to your point, was really ecstatic about that, because now I don't have to manage these users anymore, nor am I the guy that security comes and yells at because Joe Blow logged into this thing and screwed up that. It was now in the OpenShift team's pain point. So yeah, right now it's really just a Tomcat story. They are looking and evaluating next year, once this initial Tomcat replatforming is done, at some of their WebSphere environments. At this point, there's really no point or no plan to move any of the data stores onto OpenShift. That's still going to be externalized. That will change potentially as they start adopting more of the public cloud offerings and such, to see if would it be worthwhile to extract that as well if they're going to be moving from one to the other. It's an evolving story, unfortunately, so I can't tell you like everything's pinned up and ready to go. But yeah, the fact that they've gotten to this point and adopted this much as quickly, it's been very exciting. They're trying to adopt it, and that's where I was talking about this idea of removing the processes and using the new set of processes and having OpenShift being part of that new process. They're looking and evaluating how what DevOps means to them. It's still early. So right now, those processes are still somewhat controlled by what was historically the middleware team, so that they can understand how these applications are going in, because mainly there's a lot of migration efforts still ongoing. Once those are done, then I think they'll start more adopting the idea of what real DevOps type of functionalities. That's a good question. The depends on a lot of the organizational structure. I can talk to you probably a little more offline after this with the details of such. But yeah, it is kind of organization specific. I've seen some organizations go hog wild into more of really, really iterative changes, and that was okay for their organization, and others still holding back and saying, oh, we can't do that. There's still change management processes that have to be followed. There's change windows. There's all these things that really ultimately hold up the kind of innovation that they're trying to get towards. It's still a deployment team. It's the operations teams. In a perfect world, and I've seen this work, when you what OpenShift allows this to happen is if you can get to the point where you have abstracted a lot of the configuration items out of the actual container image and you're only injecting them on the deployment, that container image can be somewhat immutable, and it picks up and moves from development and into QA, and then from QA to production. So the operations teams, now that they have this image that really is just immutable, it makes it really easy for them to pick up from one registry host in the development environment, throw it into QA, and have the QA team go, or the development team start QAing and stuff going right at it. And that QA team never touched it. They were still doing all their changes in dev and everything like that. It was just this image pick up and drop, and it just makes it really easy, and it removes all those, oh crud, did you change that, and all those environmental variables that never get changed, and then something ultimately gets screwed up in production. It should just be a big pick up and move. How does what versioning work? In the container world, particularly in this, with this particular customer and one I'm thinking of, they're actually doing a version control outside of OpenShift, meaning that when they deploy a new instance, they're pulling the whole new WAR file. OpenShift does the rebuild of that new version. It's not necessarily a new layer on that particular application or that container image. So a version really is just a new built source to image, built image that then gets picked up and moved throughout the environment. So what's running in QA and production in a ideal state, and I stress ideal, is that in a development environment, all of that's been hammered out. All of that you have that makes that instance unique for development and unique for QA has been externalized for the image. The image itself is strictly just the application code. At deployment, the deployment variables that OpenShift can set up those things get set up and injected, whether it's the properties file with a persistent store, whether it's just connection strings with the, environmental variables, all those get injected so that pick up and move is literally development image, yeah, signed off, it's good to go. We pick up image and we deploy it into the QA environment, and once it's deployed in the QA environment, all the QA specific environmental variables and property files get injected at the same image, and it's off to the races. So how do you audit? And ideally, those audit and all those configurations items are in the OpenShift config file or OpenShift config inside the cluster itself, and you can audit it there. It should never really be in the container image. And that's where, in this particular customer's use case, that's what really took the longest for them to adopt the idea that we have to externalize all this stuff. You can't keep putting that data in there. And there was cases where they did pick up and move, and oh, crud, why does this still? Oh, because that data string still, or that connection string still pointing to the development environment, database, or whatever. So yeah. So I answer the second question first. Does it worthwhile just to take the existing big monolithic app and chunk it into a container or break it up into pieces? It depends on what your win is. If it's to get to the point where we can start saying we've at least automated that process and that application deployment, I would say pick it up and move it and just dump it in there. Yay, cool, win. If you're really trying to get to a more microservices environment and that's your end game, and that's going to be the ultimate win, metric win for whatever ever management tooling or management effort you're going towards, is yes, I would go that route. So I get to say this because I'm a vendor. It depends. But yeah, no, I've seen in most cases this customer was obviously just pick up and move, with the exception of just externalizing some of the the efforts. Another customer, particular in mind right now, I'm actually actively working with them. They are more times than not looking to use this as an innovation, kind of drawing line in the sand. Okay, that was cool. You had all those elements. If you want to go here, you got to start looking at more microservices environments. So it works both ways. I'm sorry. What team do you start with? No. I can give you examples where I've seen it being successful. This one was kind of an unusual case because of, again, just the necessity of needing something to be more automated. It was different. The other customer I'm actively working with, like I said a bunch before, they've seen huge amounts of benefit in just kind of this core team of small groups of application teams that were looking to innovate. A application middleware architect was sitting in the room with us, and we had one single VMware/Linux guy. And that core team did the initial stand-up, the initial deployments, started those initial application deployments, and from there, we're starting to really just kind of grow the team and grow the knowledge base across the other parts of those same organizations. Cool. Well, thank you guys for all your questions, and thank you for paying attention.